On Sunday, May 27, 1984, 18-year-old Laura Salmon left her dorm at Middle Tennessee State University, got into her beige Oldsmobile, and headed down the main road that cut through the college town of Murfreesboro. About 10 minutes later, Laura parked her car in a movie theater, stepped outside, and then waved to a young man who was waiting for her over at the box office. The young man, whose name was Dan Goodwin, was one of the new friends Laura had made since starting her freshman year of college about 8 months earlier. And this was the first time they'd gone out together, just the two of them. Laura wasn't sure if this was a date or not, but Dan's invitation for dinner and a movie definitely made it seem like it could be. She and Dan said hello, and Dan told her he had not gotten the tickets yet, because he didn't know what movie she wanted to see. Laura smiled. A lot of guys she knew would have just picked whatever movie they wanted and not worried about what she wanted at all. The two of them settled on The Natural, a new baseball movie, and they bought some tickets. Dan was a gentleman the whole time, opening doors for Laura, paying for everything, and getting the snacks that she wanted. And when they walked out after the movie ended, Laura was having a good time and was looking forward to dinner. Laura and Dan ate at a restaurant in the same shopping center as the movie theater, and they spent most of the meal getting to know each other better. Laura said college had been a big adjustment from high school, even though she still lived pretty close to her mom. But for the most part, she had enjoyed her newfound freedom. She asked Dan if he had plans for what he wanted to do after college. Laura knew this was still a long way off, but she was already set on her career. She loved performing in plays, and she wanted to be an actress. Dan said he wasn't quite sure, but whenever he thought about it, he always came back to law enforcement. He thought maybe he could be a police detective. Laura laughed. She couldn't think of two more opposite careers than theater actor and cop, but despite their different life ambitions, they got along really well and had a great night. After dinner, Dan walked Laura back to her car, and they said they'd see each other soon. On the drive home, Laura kept laughing to herself. After a whole night out with Dan, she still had no idea if what they'd just done was actually a date or not. But she didn't want to worry about it. Dan was nice and they were friends, and that was not always the case with some of the guys she met in class or at frat parties. And she wasn't necessarily looking for something serious. She'd had a long-term boyfriend for most of high school, but college was different. She didn't want to tie herself down. Early on May 30th, 1984, 3 days after Laura had gone to the movies with Dan, she woke up to the loud beep of her alarm clock. She wanted to yell at herself for staying up so late the night before. She'd had a great time dancing at a local club and hanging out with her date, but now she was going to pay for it. She had an early shift at the supermarket where she worked part-time. Laura barely pulled herself out of bed and then got ready. She put on a pair of blue jeans, a t-shirt, and a black jacket, and then headed out the door for work. The following day, around 5 p.m., a farmer in Murfreesboro drove his truck down a road that ran across the acres of property that he owned. He looked out into a large hayfield near a rock quarry, and he saw something that immediately annoyed him. Somebody had left a pile of clothes out in the middle of the grass. Finding stuff like this had actually become routine because local college and high school kids had turned this part of the farmer's land into a place to party. Now, at least once a week, he had to go pick up trash and collect empty beer cans. The farmer parked on the side of the road and got out of his truck. He slammed the door behind him and walked through some tall grass towards the clothes on the ground. But as he got closer, he stopped and just began shaking his head. He hoped his eyes were playing tricks on him and he wasn't really seeing what he thought he saw. The farmer took a few steps closer and then ran right back to his truck. He sped down the road to his house and he called 911. About a half an hour later, Detective Bob Asbury and two deputies from the Rutherford County Sheriff's Department pulled up to the hayfield and got out of their cars. The farmer had come back and was waiting for them. The farmer ominously pointed to a spot a few yards out in the high grass. The deputies stayed back to ask him some questions, and Detective Asbury put on his gloves and walked out into the field. And there, lying in the grass, he saw the dead body of a young woman. She was nude except for a bra, and her legs were spread open. A woman's black jacket covered most of her face, and lying on top of the jacket were 2 pairs of blue jeans. Asbury couldn't be sure, but the amount of bugs crawling nearby and the condition of her skin made it look like she'd been out there for a while, maybe overnight. Asbury crouched down next to the young woman's body. He could see deep wounds on the side of her head, the kind that usually indicate blunt force trauma. And the detective saw something clutched in her right hand. It was a pair of women's underwear. That detail, along with how her body was laying and the fact that she was almost naked, made Asbury think that this young woman had very likely been sexually assaulted before someone killed her. Asbury eyed the jacket covering her face, and that didn't seem too strange to him. Sometimes killers covered their victims because they couldn't bear to look at what they'd done. But the detective had no idea why somebody had also laid 2 pairs of jeans on her body. He carefully removed the jeans and then lifted the jacket to get a look at the woman's face. He saw deep bruises that looked similar to the other ones on her head, and it didn't take long for Asbury to find a potential murder weapon. He scanned the grass around the body, and he saw a couple of rocks caked with what looked like dried blood. Asbury was confident that one or both of these rocks had been used to beat this young woman to death. The detective stood up and picked up the jeans off the ground, 1 pair at a time. The first pair were men's jeans. Based on the length, they appeared to belong to someone who was at least 6 feet tall. The second pair were women's jeans, and they looked like they could be the victims. Asbury reached inside one of the pockets, and he pulled out a student ID from Middle Tennessee State University. The photo on this ID matched the victim. This young woman was Laura Salmon. Detective Asbury and the deputies worked with a Tennessee State forensics team for hours out in the field. But the only major forensic evidence they found was the blood on the rocks and also the blood spatter on both pairs of jeans. This was 1984, so DNA testing was not used by police yet. But the forensics team would take the jeans and the samples from the rocks to the lab to determine blood type, and to see if they had samples from one or potentially more than one person. That night, when Asbury returned to the station, he found a message waiting for him on his desk. Laura's car had been located at the supermarket where she worked, a few miles away from where her body had been found. It was already getting late, but Asbury had no intention of stopping yet. So, he headed across town to the supermarket and found a couple of deputies waiting for him next to a beige Oldsmobile. The detective shined his flashlight into the driver's side window, and immediately something caught his attention. The driver's seat was pushed all the way back, like someone very tall had been driving. Asbury knew Laura was relatively short, and he knew the men's jeans he'd found near her body most likely belonged to someone much taller than her. So Asbury wondered if maybe the killer had sexually assaulted and murdered Laura, left his pants at the scene, and then driven Laura's car back to the supermarket. If that was the case, it indicated that Laura's killer knew her, or at least knew enough about her to know where she worked. The detective and the deputies did a full search of the car, but nothing else really jumped out. So, after the search, Asbury headed inside the store, and he quickly found a cashier who said she had worked with Laura the previous day. She said that she and Laura had both clocked in at 8 a.m. and worked a 5-hour shift. Afterward, they walked outside together, where Laura got in her car and drove off. Asbury asked this cashier if someone had maybe been waiting by Laura's car for her, but the cashier said she didn't see anybody, and Laura had not mentioned to her that she was meeting up with anyone. Detective Asbury walked back outside and headed to his car. If he was right, a tall man who knew Laura was the last person to drive her car, so he needed to speak to somebody who might know who that man was. The following morning, Detective Asbury met with Laura's mother at her house. Laura's mom had gotten the news about her daughter the night before, and Asbury could tell she hadn't slept since. He didn't want to stay long or push Laura's mother too much, so he offered his condolences and then got right to the point. He said he was looking for a tall man who knew Laura well enough to know where she worked. In his opinion, this guy was probably Laura's close friend or a current or past romantic partner. Laura's mom didn't hesitate. She said she knew someone who fit that description perfectly, a 17-year-old named Kyle Gilly who had been Laura's high school boyfriend. That afternoon, still less than 24 hours since Laura's body had been found, Detective Asbury led Kyle and his stepfather into a conference room at the sheriff's station. Since Kyle was a minor, Asbury had made sure he had a guardian with him when he came in for questioning. Asbury noticed right away that Kyle looked to be at least 6'2" tall, and he was a big guy too, filled out, not skinny and gangly like a lot of teenagers. He was also very quiet. But without much prodding, Kyle said he'd heard about Laura's death and he was upset about it. The two of them had been together a long time in high school, and they were still close. Asbury asked him what he meant. Were they still a couple? Kyle shook his head. They were friends and they hung out sometimes, but they were not together anymore. The detective quickly followed up and asked if that made Kyle angry. But Kyle said it didn't. He was still in high school and Laura had gone off to college. He understood why, after she had graduated, she had wanted to break up. Asbury sized Kyle up again. Physically, he was the perfect fit for this. So he asked him if Kyle had ever left a pair of jeans out on that piece of farmland where kids in town went to party. Kyle got a confused look on his face. He knew about the spot on the farm, but he had no idea about any jeans of his that had gone missing out there. Detective Asbury finished by asking Kyle where he had been on May 30th, which, as far as the detective knew, was the last time anyone had seen Laura alive. Kyle said he'd come home after school, and he'd stayed there the rest of the day. And his stepfather corroborated that. He said he and Kyle had grilled a bunch of steaks together out on the patio, and then had a barbecue with the family. Following his meeting with Kyle, Asbury continued to fixate on the pair of men's jeans he'd found covering Laura's body. He was convinced those jeans were the killers, so he just had to figure out who they belonged to. So he sent members of his team to meet with some of Laura's family and high school friends, and he drove to Laura's college campus to see if there were any other tall men in her life. Asbury walked up to the dorm room that Laura had shared with two other students. He knocked, and eventually a young woman answered. He showed her his badge, and she let him inside and said that she was one of Laura's roommates. Asbury looked around the room, and it looked like a typical dorm room shared by three young teenage girls. And this just made it hit home how tragic this murder really was. Laura was so young. The detective asked the roommate when she'd last seen Laura, and the roommate said it was the night before Laura had gone to work and never came back. That night, Laura had left the dorm to go dancing at a club with a guy she'd met. And before Asbury could even ask, the roommate said she did not know who that guy was. Detective Asbury spent the day talking to more of Laura's friends and classmates, and none of them seemed to know who she'd gone to the club with on that night. But a few of her friends pointed the detective to another young man, Dan Goodwin, who had taken Laura out to a movie and dinner a few days before she had died. Asbury tracked Dan down on campus, and the young man proved to be completely cooperative. He walked the detective through the entire day he and Laura had gone out. He said they were friends, and the date was totally casual. Nothing romantic or physical at all had happened between them. He also said he had not gone dancing with Laura at the club, and he'd never gone out to that farmland with her. By the time Detective Asbury left the campus, he had two potential suspects he at least knew something about. Dan, the casual date, and Kyle, the high school boyfriend. He also had a third potential suspect who was a total mystery, the guy Laura had gone to the club with. Asbury would follow up on alibis and keep trying to identify the man at the club, but he was already desperate to find some new piece of evidence. The following morning, 3 days after Laura's body was found, Detective Asbury sat at his desk going over Laura's autopsy report. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma, which didn't surprise Asbury at all. But there was something in this report that came as a total shock. There was evidence that Laura had recently had intercourse, but there were no physical signs that usually accompanied cases of sexual assault. This meant there was a strong chance the sex had been consensual and could have happened hours or even the day before the murder. This was not what Asbury had suspected when he'd first seen Laura's body, because she was naked from the waist down, her legs were spread, and she had underwear in her hand. So now, Asbury wondered if her killer had simply staged the scene to make it look like Laura had been sexually assaulted just to throw off investigators. If that was the case, the men's jeans might not belong to the killer at all. They could have been placed there by somebody else. In fact, if the crime scene had been staged like that, Laura's killer might not even be a man. On June 4th, 4 days after Laura's body was found, Laura's mother sat in the chapel crying as mourners filed out of Laura's funeral. Dan, the young man who had gone out with Laura just days before she died, walked up to Laura's mom and said how sorry he was and how wonderful a person Laura had been. Laura's mother instinctively pulled Dan in for a hug, and she told him to please help her find who killed her baby. Dan gave her a big hug back and then looked her in the eye and said he would. He would find Laura's killer. Over the next month, Detective Asbury and members of the Tennessee State Police continued to interview Laura's friends and acquaintances, but they weren't getting any closer to identifying her killer. And then, one afternoon, Asbury got a call from police in Nashville, Tennessee, 40 miles away. The Nashville cop said a woman had just accused a man named John Taylor of raping her, and she claimed that John had told her if she resisted, he would do to her what he did to Laura Salmon. Asbury almost couldn't believe it. It was like the huge tip he had been waiting for had just fallen into his lap. Talking to the Nashville officer, Asbury quickly learned that John had a history of violence, and he went to Middle Tennessee State University just like Laura. Asbury hung up and took off for Laura's campus. When he got there, he looked up John's records and began sifting through those, and then he also spoke to some of Laura's friends he'd already met, and it would turn out that Laura and John went to the same fitness center on campus, and they'd gone to a bunch of the same fraternity parties. At this point, Asbury didn't waste any time. He and a state police officer drove right to Nashville to interview John, who was still in custody on the rape charge. John insisted that the sex between him and the woman accusing him of rape was consensual, and he claimed he never said a word about Laura. That was a total lie. And like Asbury's other suspects, John said he'd never gone dancing at a club with Laura, and he said he barely even knew who she was. Asbury left Nashville later that day feeling frustrated. But despite John's claims that he was innocent, the detective thought he made a very strong suspect. However, unless he could find something concrete connecting John or the other young men who were suspects directly to the crime scene on the farmer's land, then he couldn't go after any of them. Over the next several weeks, Detective Asbury continued to work the case every day, but he never felt like he was getting any closer to solving it. Soon, months passed without any new evidence coming in, and Asbury had other cases he had to start focusing on. During this time, Laura's mother came to the sheriff's station often, but every time she asked for an update on her daughter's case, she got the same reply. There was no new information at this time. And Laura's mom got that same response for years. She watched as Laura's friends graduated college and went on with their lives. She saw the young men who had been suspects in her daughter's murder grow up and start families of their own. And she saw Detective Asbury retire and Laura's case go completely cold. Fast forward to February of 2000, almost 16 years after Laura's murder. Two detectives with the Rutherford County Sheriff's Department stood over a conference table staring down at a stack of file folders. These detectives had been assigned to handle cold cases, and their first big case together was Laura Salmon's murder. The lead detective was Lieutenant Bill Sharp, and the detective assisting him was none other than Dan Goodwin, the same young man who had taken Laura out for a movie and dinner shortly before she died, and the same Dan who had promised Laura's mother he would find Laura's killer. Dan, who was now in his 30s, flipped open one of the folders and saw a photo of Laura. Then he began flipping through pages of notes from the original investigation, and as he did, he felt Lieutenant Sharp standing over him. Sharp leaned down and wrote 3 letters across the top of one of Laura's files, DNA. Dan nodded. Technology had come a long way since Laura's murder, and now DNA testing was commonplace and effective and could potentially solve this case. So the first step the investigators took was to connect with the state crime lab. They arranged for a series of tests to be conducted on the blood samples taken from the rocks found at the murder scene and from the 2 pairs of blue jeans that had been left on Laura's body. All the samples had been well preserved, so the lab felt confident they would find something. However, they informed Dan and Lieutenant Sharp that the lab was pretty backed up, and it might take a while to get results. So while they waited, Dan and Lieutenant Sharp began working their way through the files and re-interviewed everyone they could. They also tracked down Laura's old high school boyfriend, Kyle Gilley, and secured a DNA sample from him. And they did the same with John Taylor, the man who had been accused of rape by that young woman in Nashville. And on a day not long after those samples had been sent to the lab, Lieutenant Sharp approached Dan at the station. Sharp tossed a file folder onto Dan's desk and told him, "Now it's your turn." Dan flipped open the file and saw it was a record of his interview from the original investigation. For a second, it threw Dan off. He'd been so caught up in his work that he hadn't thought about himself as being a potential suspect. But he told Sharp that, of course, he would provide a DNA sample. Despite the fact that Dan was a suspect in this case, he was allowed to stay on the investigation, because after he had provided his DNA sample, he was cleared of any wrongdoing. He was not Laura's killer. In the spring of 2000, a couple of months into this new investigation, Dan and Sharp sat at the conference table, digging through Laura's files like they did almost every day. They had conducted interviews, revisited the crime scene, and they had secured DNA samples, but they were still waiting on DNA test results. And they were starting to feel like the original investigators had felt. There were several solid suspects, but not enough evidence to point to any one of them. But that particular day, something in one of the files jumped out at Sharp for the first time. It was a witness statement from a young woman that seemed to have just gone overlooked during the original investigation, and it was potentially a huge break. Lieutenant Sharp pointed it out to Dan, and Dan just stared in shock. Suddenly, he felt like he was close to solving the murder of his friend and keeping his promise to her mother. Both detectives meticulously went through the other files to see if anyone had ever followed up with this witness, but no one ever had. So Dan and Sharp tracked her down. And even though so much time had passed, this witness said she still remembered that day very clearly, and she stood by her original statement. The detectives knew a single statement from over 15 years earlier would not be enough for the district attorney to take a murder case to trial, but they felt like their investigation finally had a clear direction. Then, on May 31st, 2000, 16 years to the day from when Laura's body was found, DNA test results came back from the lab. Dan and Lieutenant Sharp sat at the table and read the report, and both felt completely energized and like they were almost at the end of this investigation. The test results confirmed that the blood on the rocks and on both pairs of jeans was Laura's, but the blood pattern found on the men's jeans could only have occurred if the person wearing them had been on top of Laura when she was struck in the head. So there was now strong evidence that Detective Asbury had been right from the moment he saw Laura's body back in 1984. The men's jeans belonged to the killer. Dan and Sharp kept reading through the results, and as they did, they kept feeling more and more like the witness they had spoken to must have been telling the truth. And then finally, they saw test results that said DNA samples from bodily fluids had been found in the men's jeans, and they had a match for those samples. Dan stepped back from the table, and he felt like he wanted to collapse, like a huge burden had finally been lifted. After all this time, Laura's murder had just been solved. Based on DNA tests, the witness statement, and evidence collected over 16 years during 2 investigations, the following is what police believe happened to Laura Salmon on May 30th, 1984. That afternoon, Laura walked out of the supermarket with her coworker, said goodbye, and then got into her car. As soon as she began driving, she felt like she might fall asleep. She was exhausted from her night out at the club the night before. She drove a few minutes across town and saw her killer waiting for her right outside of their place. Laura parked, got out of the car, and told the killer how exhausted she was. She also said she could only hang out for a little while. The killer said that was totally fine, and they offered to drive since Laura was tired. Laura tossed her car keys to the killer, and then they both climbed into her beige Oldsmobile. The killer immediately had to move the driver's seat way back so they could fit, and then once they were comfortable, they began driving down the main road in town. But a few minutes later, the killer suddenly pulled onto a road that cut through some farmland. Laura asked where they were going, and the killer said it was a surprise. The killer drove a bit longer and then parked the car on the side of the road by a hayfield that was near a rock quarry. Laura looked out the window. She knew the spot from some parties. It was a beautiful day, and Laura was still feeling pretty sleepy, so sitting outside in this field seemed like a nice way to spend some time. However, before Laura could get out of the car, the killer snapped at her and started yelling at her about the night before. Laura yelled right back and said the killer was way out of line, and then she told them to just turn the car around and drive her back to her dorm. But the killer didn't. Instead, they lunged across the front seat, grabbed Laura, and punched her in the face. Laura's eye and her head immediately began throbbing, but she managed to break free from the killer, and she threw the car door open and began running into the field. The killer rushed out of the car, caught up to Laura, and tackled her to the ground. Laura tried to fight back, but the killer was too strong, and they climbed on top of her and pinned her down. Then, the killer reached over, grabbed a rock off the ground, and slammed it into the side of Laura's head multiple times. Blood sprayed from the wounds, and Laura stopped moving. But the killer wasn't done. They dropped that rock and picked up a bigger one, and they raised it up and then slammed it down right square in the middle of Laura's face over and over again. Finally, the killer stopped. They dropped the rock, stood up, and looked down at what they had done. Laura lay there, dead in the grass. The killer began to panic, but they quickly came up with a plan. They ripped off Laura's jacket, her shirt, her jeans, and her underwear, and then stuffed her underwear into Laura's right hand. And then they deliberately posed her legs so her legs were spread open. When the killer stepped back and took a look at their work, they saw Laura's eyes were staring up at them. So they grabbed the jacket and covered most of Laura's face with it. The killer was about to head back to the car, but they looked down and noticed Laura's blood on their jeans. So without thinking, they just took off their jeans. They also grabbed Laura's jeans off the ground, and they laid both pairs across Laura's body. After that, the killer ran back to Laura's car and drove back to the supermarket where Laura worked. After parking the car, the killer scanned the parking lot. When they saw it was all clear, they hopped out and took off running in their underwear. And when they got there, they found their stepfather waiting for them. Laura's high school boyfriend, Kyle Gilley, was her killer. It turned out Kyle was not okay with their breakup, like he had told police. In fact, the idea of Laura seeing anyone other than him filled Kyle with jealousy and rage. So much so that he had begun stalking Laura. And on the night before her murder, he followed her and her date, a man who was never identified, to the club. Kyle hid in the shadows and watched Laura dance all night, and then he followed Laura and her date back to the guy's apartment, and then waited outside while they had consensual sex, and then followed them when Laura's date drove her back to her dorm. The following day, Laura and Kyle had plans to hang out like they still did sometimes, and when Laura handed Kyle her keys, he knew this was his chance to take her out to the middle of nowhere and make her pay for seeing other men. Like a lot of kids in town, Kyle had been to the farmer's land for parties, and he thought it would be a perfect place to confront Laura because nobody else would be around. But as soon as she yelled at him, he couldn't stand it and he punched her. And this was not the first time he had done that. In fact, during the second investigation, Dan and Lieutenant Sharp had discovered Kyle had regularly beaten Laura throughout their high school relationship. This, of course, raised a huge red flag, but it was the overlooked witness statement that enabled them to fully focus their investigation on Kyle. Because back in 1984, a young woman had told police that on the day of Laura's murder, she passed by Kyle driving on the road, and he was driving Laura's beige Oldsmobile, and Laura was not in the car with him. Dan and Lieutenant Sharp never understood why that lead had not been followed up on, and why Kyle and his stepfather's story about grilling steaks together had just been accepted. But with that witness statement, Dan and Sharp were almost positive Kyle was the killer, and DNA test results soon confirmed that theory. In a moment of desperation, Kyle had staged the murder to look like a sexual assault. He hoped it would lead police to the man Laura had gone to the club with and slept with the night before, but when Kyle saw Laura's blood on his jeans, he panicked and left them behind. Because there was no DNA testing at the time, Kyle would never have imagined that remnants of his own bodily fluids inside those jeans would someday allow police to trace the genes right back to him. Kyle was ultimately sentenced to life in prison, but with a chance for parole in 2042. Kyle's stepfather, who had covered for him in 1984, was deceased by the time Kyle was arrested. Dan had ultimately kept his promise to Laura's mother. He had found her daughter's killer. Dan also said that if he and Kyle are both still alive in 2042, he will be front and center at Kyle's parole hearing, and he'll do everything he can to make sure Kyle never gets out of prison. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. In 2013, Jim Stauffer's mother finally passed away from Alzheimer's disease at the age of 74. Her doctors told Jim that her disease had mutated in a way they had not seen before, and they asked if he'd be willing to donate her body so they could study her brain. Jim felt like his mother would want him to say yes, and so he agreed. But for a variety of administrative reasons, the neurologists couldn't actually accept Jim's mother's body. At this point, Jim was really bought into the idea that his mother's brain was going to help other patients, and so while he couldn't donate her body to these neurologists, he could donate her body to the Biological Resource Center in Phoenix, Arizona. This center would take dead bodies and then extract parts of them for scientific research, and then would cremate the rest of them and return the ashes to the family. Jim gave his mother's body to the center, and when he filled out the paperwork, he indicated that her brain should be extracted for Alzheimer's research. After filling out the paperwork, Jim left, and 10 days later, he received a wooden box in the mail that contained his mother's ashes. There was no note attached to the box explaining exactly what was done to his mother's body, but Jim assumed they did what he asked. A year later, that Biological Resource Center was raided by the FBI after accusations they were selling these donated bodies for profit. During the FBI's investigation, they uncovered that yes, the center had been doing that and had sold at least 20 bodies to the US Army for various experiments, and one of the bodies that was sold was Jim's mother. She was sold for $5,893. The FBI told Jim she had not been used for Alzheimer's research. Instead, she had been strapped to this device that resembled a chair and then had a bomb detonated underneath her. The Army was trying to understand the effects on the human body when a vehicle is hit by an IED. The ashes Jim received in that wooden box he got in the mail were only from his mother's hand. The rest of her body was unrecoverable. Also, during this FBI investigation, they found inside the center there was a man's body on the wall with a female head sewed onto it. It appeared to be a trophy. Jim, along with 19 other families, sued the center, and finally, in 2019, they were awarded $58 million in damages. The center no longer is in operation. In 2004, Mitch was in his final semester at a college in Louisiana when he met another senior, a wonderful young lady named Kayla. From the instant he saw her, he knew he was in love. She played hard to get at first, but after several months, he won her over. After graduation, the pair stayed in Louisiana and moved in together while they got their careers off the ground. 2 years later, the pair got married, and almost immediately, Kayla got pregnant. At the time, Mitch's career was really starting to take off, which allowed Kayla to stay at home and take some time off. By the time their daughter was born, Mitch was making so much money that Kayla decided to just stay home and be a full-time mom. A couple years later, Kayla got pregnant again, and by the time their daughter was 2 years old, they had their son. Mitch adored his children. Every morning before he went to work, he would sneak into their room and he would watch them sleep, and then in the evenings they would have these big family sit-down meals and then play games together until bedtime. Mitch's life was perfect. Shortly after his son's birth, Mitch was lounging on the couch in his TV room when he noticed out of the corner of his eye the red lamp in the corner of the room. It just looked funny. It was almost like the light itself was blurry, but when he looked a little bit closer at it, the entire lamp looked blurry. And so Mitch looked around the room and nothing else was blurry. He rubbed his eyes and looked back over at this lamp and it was still blurry. He turned the TV off and walked over to the lamp, and even though he was right in front of it, the lamp was still blurry. And Mitch didn't have bad eyesight, and so he's thinking, is there something wrong with me? Am I having a stroke? Do I have an aneurysm? Is there some sort of illness here that's making me see this lamp blurry when it's really not? But Mitch told himself he was healthy and that whatever this was, it was an anomaly and nothing to worry about. And so he went back over to the couch, turned the TV back on, and tried to ignore the lamp. But as he was watching TV, out of his peripheral vision, he couldn't help but notice this weird blurry lamp. And so finally, he turned the TV off again, and he turned to look at this lamp. And now, in addition to being blurry, it appeared to be upside down. Now Mitch was genuinely concerned that there was something wrong with him, because again, nothing else in the entire room was blurry or upside down. It was just this lamp. And so a few minutes later, his wife and his kids came home, and Mitch decided he would not tell them about this lamp. He didn't want to alarm them. He figures he will get to the bottom of this blurry lamp, and then he will tell his wife and kids. And so that night, the family has a sit-down meal, and then afterwards they play some games together, and then everybody goes upstairs and goes to sleep. But after everyone had gone to sleep, Mitch was just laying in bed thinking about this lamp. And so finally, he snuck out of his bed and went downstairs to the TV room, and he sat on the couch, and he just stared at this lamp. And for hours and hours, he just fixated himself on this lamp, watching it kind of morph around and turn upside down and get blurrier and blurrier by the second. The next day, Kayla found Mitch lying on the couch, passed out, and she asked him if he was okay. And again, Mitch didn't tell her about this lamp that was still blurry. He just told her that he wasn't feeling well and he was not going to go to work that day. But Mitch didn't go to work for 3 more days. He just sat on the couch and stared at this lamp. And Kayla obviously picked up on this strange behavior and kept poking and prodding to get more information about what was going on, but Mitch never told her the truth about this lamp. He just kept telling her he felt sick. She urged him to go see a doctor, but Mitch told her it would be fine, he'd get better. And then over time, as this lamp continued to morph and get bigger and get stranger and stranger, Mitch suddenly was unable to respond to his wife. He became totally unresponsive. And so obviously his wife became desperate and called the doctor. And as she's on the phone with the doctor trying to get advice about what to do, Mitch realizes the lamp is now growing in leaps and bounds. And before long, the lamp is the entire size of the room, and all he can see is the red color of this lamp. And then Mitch starts to hear these voices, these screams coming from somewhere in the distance. And then he feels this blinding pain in his head. And then he opens his eyes and he looks up and he sees he's laying on the sidewalk next to one of the buildings at his college in Louisiana. And surrounding him is this crowd of people with wide eyes that are staring at him. Mitch had no idea what was going on, and so he naturally just began scanning the crowd, looking for Kayla and his kids to try to figure out, how he got here. But before he could ask any questions and before he could find his wife and kids, a police officer ran through the crowd, picked him up and ran him over to his police car, put him in the back, and then began driving away. And so while Mitch is in the back of this police car, he turns to the officer and he says, "What's going on?" And the officer would tell him he was attacked by a huge college football player. He got hit in the head and he fell backwards and he hit his head again and he fell unconscious. Mitch asked the officer where his wife and kids were, and the cop said he had no idea. And that's when it clicked for Mitch. The lamp wasn't real. Neither was his wife, neither was his daughter, neither was his son, neither was his life. For the past 10 years, it was all a hallucination while he was unconscious after getting attacked. Mitch was brought to the hospital where he would make a full physical recovery, but after being released, he was horribly depressed, and he had to get intense therapy to basically grieve for the loss of his family that never existed. These days, Mitch says he can barely remember what his family even looked like, but periodically in his dreams, he will catch a glimpse of his son in his peripheral vision, and his son is perpetually 5 years old, and he's trying to talk to his father, but Mitch can never understand what he says. In 2007, Brett Ryan was a charming 26-year-old man living in Toronto, Canada. He was known as an extremely friendly guy who was always smiling ear to ear with his trademark grin. In his spare time, he could be found at children's hospitals reading to sick kids, or at the community center volunteering as an umpire for Little League baseball games. But behind his seemingly perfect exterior, behind the scenes, Brett was struggling. He had to move back in with his parents after dropping out of college and racking up over $60,000 of debt. While his friends graduated college and went on to begin their careers in medicine and finance and education, Brett was only able to get a job as a part-time house painter. Brett felt like he had a lot of potential that he was squandering, but he felt like the debt that he had racked up was really his roadblock between him and the life he was supposed to have. And so instead of working hard and making some money to pay down his debt, he decided to come up with an absurd get-rich-quick scheme that actually kind of worked. On October 20th of that year, Brett walked into a bank near his home, and he had hospital hospital bandages wrapped around his head and his face, and his left arm was in a sling. And he walked up to one of the tellers and he handed her a note that just said, "I have a gun underneath this sling, give me $2,000. And the teller very quickly complied, and she gave him a little over $1,000. That was all the money she had. And Brett took the money, turned around, and calmly walked out of the bank. And he got in his car and he got home, and he was totally exhilarated, and he's half expecting the police to just show up at his front door, but they never did. He was never caught. And after that, he was hooked. For the next 8 months, Brett robbed a dozen other banks in the area, stealing almost $30,000. He became so confident in his ability to steal without getting caught that he began dressing up in these ridiculous outfits that included this huge, obviously fake beard. And in fact, the media dubbed him the fake bearded bandit. The reason Brett wasn't getting caught is because the police would get his fingerprints at the crime scene, but because he did not have a criminal record, his prints were not in the database. And so the police basically just had to set up and hope to catch this guy in the act. And in the summer of 2008, they finally would catch the fake bearded bandit. At Brett's trial, dozens of his friends wrote letters of support to the judge saying that Brett was actually a great guy, that this was a product of desperation and a total break from his normal character. And some of the organizations that he volunteered with did the same thing, writing letters to the judge saying what a meaningful contributor Brett was to the community. When Brett spoke at his trial, he was incredibly remorseful and said he had allowed his debt to get totally out of control and that admittedly he had not handled it well. And so the judge took all of this into account, all the letters of support and Brett's overall appearance in court, and he decided that this was indeed a break from character and that Brett was actually a very promising young man and that he did not deserve the harshest penalty. And so Brett was sentenced to just under 4 years, which considering the crime was a very lenient sentence. And so Brett went to jail, but then less than 2 years later in 2010, he was granted parole and allowed to move back in with his parents. And his parents would say he was a changed man ready for a fresh start. But Brett would find life outside of jail was exponentially harder now that he was an ex-con. It was extremely hard to get a job, which meant he had no income, and without an income, he couldn't pay down all those debts he had, and so he had to declare bankruptcy. As for life at home, it was very difficult. Brett's family was very embarrassed about what he had done, and when Brett moved back home, it was obvious that all the neighbors were gossiping constantly about their family. And so Brett and his family actually moved to another Toronto neighborhood just to get away from all of that. But once they settled into this new neighborhood, Brett really knuckled down and decided he was going to get his life together and he was going to do it all on his own. And so he applied to dozens and dozens of jobs all over the place, and finally he was able to get some low-paying work in retail. It wasn't great, but it was a start. And so Brett began working countless hours at this really low-paying job, and his parents noticed how hard he was working to try to get his life back together, and so they decided they would help him out financially so he could re-enroll in college and finish his degree in biophysics. While Brett was in school, he met a woman named Kristen who had a full-time job and lived in this beautiful home, and by and large, she had the life that he wished he could have. And the two of them quickly fell in love, and Brett told her about his criminal past as the fake bearded bandit, and she accepted him, and she didn't judge him, and she said, "I still love you, I still want to be with you." 2 years later, Brett moved out of his parents' house and into Kristen's house, and for once in his life, he felt like his life was going the way it should be. Then, a year later, tragedy struck when Brett's father passed away, and suddenly Brett had to go to his mother's house all the time to try to help her out. And his mother was very appreciative of the time he was spending with her, and so she actually began paying him for the work he was doing around the home. And considering Brett was a broke college student, this was a huge help, and in many ways, it really brought Brett and his mother together. A year later, in 2015, Brett proposed to Kristen, and she said yes. But at the same time, school was getting overwhelming for Brett, and he dropped out. But he was too embarrassed to tell his fiance or his family because everybody thought he was on the right path and he didn't want to explain why he had dropped out, and so he just pretended to still be in school. Then in the spring of 2016, when Brett should have been graduating, he got a very lucky break when a big tech firm in Toronto offered him a job. On paper, Brett should not have gotten this job. He wasn't qualified, he didn't have a degree. But in getting this job, Brett was able to tell his fiance and his family that he had just graduated college and and that was how he was getting this job. His family and his fiance were a little confused why they weren't invited to his graduation ceremony, but nonetheless, they were very excited for him and they took him out and they celebrated. Then, a week after Brett accepted this job, the tech firm rescinded their offer when they discovered Brett was in fact the fake bearded bandit. Now, Brett panicked because this job represented this perfect piece to his web of lies that allowed him to pretend he had his degree and that everything was so great, and so he couldn't possibly tell his fiance and his family that he didn't get this job. And so he decided he would just lie and pretend to go to this job every day. Meanwhile, Brett's mom began bragging to all of her new neighbors about her son Brett, who had really turned his life around. He graduated from college, he got this great job, he's got a beautiful fiance, he's got this wonderful home. Everything is just going great for Brett. At first, Brett was able to push the guilt out of his subconscious and just live this ridiculous lie, but as his wedding day approached, the weight of all these lies and the guilt he felt, it became overwhelming, and practically speaking, he was worried about how he would explain to his new wife why he had no income despite having this full-time job. And so he went to his mother and he told her the truth about dropping out of college, about not getting that job offer, and then he said, "Can you keep all of this a secret? And can you give me a whole bunch of money so I can keep living this lie?" And she said, "No. And in fact, you need to tell your fiance that you're lying or I will." This was the worst case scenario for Brett and one that he was not prepared for. He really thought his mom would be like, "Yep, let's do it. Let's keep this thing going." But when she didn't, he didn't really know what to do. He believed if Kristen found out the truth, she would leave him and that would ruin his perfect life. And so he decided he would not tell Kristen. Instead, he would kill his mother. Because he was an ex-con, he couldn't buy a firearm. However, he could buy a crossbow. And so he ordered his crossbow, he watched a couple YouTube videos about how to operate it, and then on one of his trips to his mother's house to help out, he stashed the crossbow and some arrows on a shelf in her garage. Then, when he got home, he began designing these bizarre contraptions that were built out of fans and pulleys and broomsticks that, when turned on, would move around the room and click on his keyboard and turn his phone off and on. It was designed to help him build an alibi when he was out committing murder. His devices would be turning on and off again, giving the impression that he was at home the whole time. On August 25th, 2017, all his preparations were done. He woke up early that morning and he began getting ready for his fake job. At the same time, Kristen was also getting ready for her real job, and then at 7:30, when they were both ready to go, they hopped in their respective cars and headed out for the day. But Brett slowed down at the end of the street and waited for Kristen to disappear around the corner. Brett turned back, went back into his house. He went up to his room and turned on all of his bizarre alibi contraptions that he made sure were turning off and on his devices correctly. And after a while, once he was confident these devices would work, he hopped in his car and he drove over to his mother's house. He got there around 10 a.m. He walked inside and his mother was sitting in the kitchen, and he approached her about changing her mind about telling the truth to Kristen. But his mother was staunch and she said, "No, I'm going to tell her before your wedding unless you do." And so their exchange got really heated, and before long his mother actually called one of his older brothers, Chris, to come to her house and talk to Brett to defuse this situation. Brett was furious and stormed out of the kitchen. He grabbed the door that led into the garage and he stormed in to try to get his crossbow off the shelf. But his mother followed after him. Now, the crossbow had not been loaded when he put it up on that shelf, and Brett was not very good at loading it, and it would take several seconds to actually do it. So he's thinking to himself, when I pull that down and begin loading it, she's going to see the weapon and she's going to run outside before I can get to her. And so when he reached up, he didn't grab the crossbow, he grabbed the arrows. And in a swift motion, he pulled them down, re-gripped them like a knife, faced his mother, and began attacking her viciously. She fell backwards and a shelf actually landed on top of her, pinning her to the ground. At which point Brett seized the opportunity. He got up, grabbed a piece of nylon, he wrapped it around her neck, and he suffocated her. As soon as she was dead, Brett pulled her out from under the shelf and dragged her to the side of the garage. He put the shelf back up, and then he began loading his crossbow because he knew Chris, his older brother that his mother had called, was going to be here soon. And so he hid behind the door inside of the garage and just waited. And at some point he heard Chris's car pull into the driveway. Chris walked into the house, he yelled for his mom, he yelled for Brett, but he didn't get a response. And eventually Chris made his way to the open door leading into the garage. He stepped inside, and as soon as he did, Brett silently got up behind him and he fired one shot directly into the back of his neck, killing him instantly. Brett took Chris's body and piled it on top of his mother's, and as he was putting a tarp over top of them, he heard another car pulling into the driveway. It was his younger brother, AJ. Now, at this point, Brett knows he is in too deep and he has to finish the job, and so he doesn't have time to load his crossbow, and so again, he just grabs one of the arrows and he walks outside and he sees AJ getting out of his car and he runs up to him and he jabs the arrow into his brother's neck. And so they're fighting in the driveway. Meanwhile, Brett's other brother, Lee, who's actually in the house sleeping, he wakes up to the sound of this commotion outside in the driveway. He looks out the window and he sees his brothers fighting, and so he runs downstairs and he comes outside, and at this point AJ is laying on the ground and he's basically motionless, and Brett is standing over him, and Brett turns and he sees Lee in the doorway and he runs off after him. Lee sees his brother running at him and just turns and runs into the house, but he only gets a few feet before Brett jumps on top of them, and then the two of them have this vicious fight where Brett is trying to stab him with the arrows, and they're basically both fighting for their lives. And at some point, after Lee suffered several very deep cuts, he manages to throw Brett off of him, and he runs outside to his brother AJ, who's now crawled all the way to the street. And in fact, AJ had managed to flag down a neighbor and got his neighbor to call the police. As for Brett, after Lee had managed to fight him off and ran outside, he knew he was done. And so instead of chasing his brother outside, he put his arrow down and he walked into the kitchen. He opened up the fridge, he took a bottle of water out, he left the fridge door open and just walked out to the front steps and sat down and drank his water while he waited for police to show up. When they did arrive, his brother AJ died before they could save him. As police were arresting Brett, he kind of casually said, "Yeah, I should have taken AJ to the hospital, I could have saved him. And the other guys in the garage are dead, crossbow to the head. It was me." In court, Brett was extremely remorseful and pled guilty to all of his charges. The judge told Brett that he was appreciative of the fact that he was taking full ownership of his heinous crimes, and that in many ways he was a victim too, a victim of this huge web of lies that Brett just couldn't get out from under. But nonetheless, Brett was given 3 consecutive life terms, one for each of the murders he committed. The only surviving family member, Lee, the brother who was attacked last and managed to run outside and escape Brett, he said that his life was shattered that day and that he can barely go outside because of his extreme post-traumatic stress.